As far as key findings are concerned, this is an important statement. Warming of the climate system is unequivocal, and therefore there's no reason to doubt the science anymore. If you look at observed changes, and these are just observed changes, going back in time to the beginning of industrialization, you see the increase in global average temperature that's taken place. It's amounted to 0.74 degrees during the 20th century. And you see these ups and downs, which are really the result of both natural as well as human-induced factors in climate change. But the last 7 or 8 decades show a very steady and perceptible increase in temperature. Similarly, if you look at global average sea level rise, during the 20th century, it's been about 17 centimeters. May not appear like a lot, but if you're living in the Maldives Islands or any of the small island states, which are barely a meter above sea level, then this can be life-threatening. It can certainly instill a great deal of fear of the future. Northern Hemisphere snow cover has gone down correspondingly, and those who are questioning our scientific abilities to be able to differentiate between human as well as natural changes in the climate can look at this diagram where you see observations going back to the beginning of the 20th century. And if you look at model runs which only take into account natural factors or natural forcing, you get this sharp difference between these two curves. But the moment you enter human-induced factors and increase in greenhouse gas emissions concentration, you get virtually a perfect fit with actual observations. So we have now enough validity in the work that we have done to give us confidence that our models are giving us predictions or projections that are totally reliable. We know that the frequency of heavy precipitation events has increased over most land areas, and this is happening across the world, every part of the world. And I can tell you about this event, which took place in 2005. About 1 million people lost their homes because in the entire city of Mumbai, which suffered a massive cloud burst in a short period of time, was completely underwater, and several people actually lost their lives. Similarly, heat waves have become more frequent. You remember the heat wave in Europe in 2003, which resulted in about 35,000 deaths. Tropical cyclone activities increased in the North Atlantic, and Hurricane Katrina, which clearly was a major disaster, was clearly the kind of event that you would see happening much more frequently and much more intensely. Longer droughts are taking place, and this has been in evidence since the 1970s, particularly in the tropics and subtropics. We know that if we continue with greenhouse gas emissions the way we've been used to in the past, then we would find many changes in the global climate system during the 21st century. And these would very likely be larger than those observed during the 20th century. So we are in for a period, unless we take effective and urgent action, that would spell much worse impacts in the future. Concentrations of greenhouse gases have gone up drastically. If you go back 10,000 years in time, you see the rapid rate at which increases have taken place in the past few decades. And those of you who've seen Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth, would remember when he was showing this plot of carbon dioxide emissions and he reached this steep area, he actually mounted an elevator and went all the way up. I don't see one over here, so you'll have to take my word for this steep increase. US emissions have risen by 14.7% in the last 16 years, and this only testifies to the fact that the Framework Convention on Climate Change has really not been taken seriously so far. Projected surface temperature changes by the end of the century would range from 1.1 to 6.4 degrees Celsius. And this is based on a number of scenarios that the IPCC uses, looking at the future in terms of economic, technological, and social changes. Now, even if you take the lowermost figure over here, that combined with the 0.74 degree increase that took place in the 20th century will give you a very serious level of temperature increase, the result of which will be several impacts. And for the first time, I think in the fourth assessment report, we were able to link specific impacts of climate change with corresponding increases in average temperature. And you can see, even with 1 degree increase in temperature, you would have serious impacts with water. Those at the back may not be able to read this, I'm sorry. Ecosystems are endangered. Food security would be at risk. Coastal areas are certainly prone to damage from floods and storms, and health impacts, both as a result of extreme events, that's floods, droughts, heat waves, but also because of increase in disease vectors. Mountains would lead to reduction in snowpack, and summer flows would be reduced, and this, of course, will lead to exacerbating the competition over allocated water resources. I was recently with the President of Pakistan, who is quite concerned with water problems across the subcontinent. And I can tell you from the IPCC's projections, something like 500 million people in South Asia would be affected as a result of the decline in river flows that would occur with the reduction in the size of glaciers across those high mountains. Heat waves certainly are going to be more common. Coastal communities and habitats will be increasingly stressed by climate change impacts, and this will interact with development and pollution at the local level. Water stress will increase substantially. 120 to 1.2 billion people would suffer from water stress by 2020 in Asia. The worst affected perhaps will be Africa, with 75 to 250 million people by 2020. And this, incidentally, is a continent where you already have high levels of water stress in several parts. What's perhaps even more worrisome is the yield reduction in agriculture. And here I'll focus on the number for Africa, which could be 50% reduction by 2020. And crop revenues could go down by 90% by the end of the century in several African countries. So in other words, those regions which are already impoverished to an unacceptable level will possibly be facing a much worse situation in the future. Now, we know that neither adaptation nor mitigation alone can avoid all climate change impacts. However, they can complement each other and together can significantly reduce the risks of climate change. Therefore, our policy in the future globally will have to rest on both mitigation as well as adaptation. Now, communities all over the world have been adapting to the impacts of climate change for a long period of time, but today the rate at which the climate is changing would clearly exceed the capacity of these communities to be able to handle the impacts that they are going to suffer. Mitigation, and I'm coming to the last part of my presentation, mitigation is going to be critical, because if we want to, say, limit the global mean temperature increase to what is shown over here in the topmost row, 2 to 2.4 degrees Celsius, then we would have to stabilize our concentration of these gases at a little above where we are today. But if we were to do that, we have a very short window of time. We will have to ensure that by 2015, we don't peak, we don't go beyond the peak that we reach in 2015. And emissions will have to reduce substantially after that. And the faster they reduce, the greater the opportunity or the greater the possibility of being able to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. The cost of this is not going to be high. In fact, we have assessed for roughly this level of mitigation, the cost in 2030 will be less than 3% of the global GDP. And that really means that if we were to continue to grow without mitigation steadily, let's say, this is the kind of line you would get. If you were to mitigate at a stringent level, then this line would just bend a little downwards.